The mineral that greased cart, axles, armored tanks, and landed on the moon. There's a mineral that reduces metal-on-metal friction more effectively than almost any oil on Earth. It is not rare. It is not exotic. It comes out of the ground in Colorado, Norway, China, and Australia, and its story runs through Japanese swordsmiths, 2 world wars, and the Apollo lunar landings. The mineral is molybdenite, and the compound inside it that does the work is molybdenum disulfide, MoS2 for short. This is its real history and the real science behind why it works. A mountain valley in Norway. In 1885, farmers in a valley called Knaben in southern Norway noticed dark, greasy outcroppings in the hillsides. When they rubbed the stones between their fingers, the mineral left a soft, black residue, almost like graphite. They called it pencil stone because it marked paper the way a soft lead pencil does. The farmers found a practical use for it almost immediately. They crushed the mineral and rubbed it on the axles of their wooden carts. The wheels turned more easily and the axles wore more slowly. For decades, it was traded locally, valued at little more than the cost of butter. That changed with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Germany had developed hardened, heat-resistant steel for weapons and armor plating, and the key alloying element was molybdenum. Almost overnight, a mineral that had been worth pennies became a strategic wartime resource. World molybdenum production rose sharply during the war years as armies on both sides sought the metal for armor-piercing shells and gun barrels that could withstand higher temperatures without losing their strength. Molybdenum itself had been identified far earlier. In 1778, the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele isolated molybdic acid from the mineral molybdenite and recognized it as a distinct element, laying the groundwork for molybdenum's later isolation as a metal. What Scheele could not have known was that the same mineral farmers were smearing on cart axles a century later contained a second separate value, not as an alloy inside steel, but as a lubricant between 2 surfaces of steel, Leadville, Colorado, and the Climax mine. On the other side of the Atlantic, a very similar mineral was being pulled out of a mountain near Leadville, Colorado. The Climax mine, developed in the early 20th century by mining engineer Otis King. Climax became the largest molybdenum mining operation in the world, and at its peak, the mine and its surrounding company town were significant enough that Climax supplied a large share of the world's molybdenum through both world wars. The Climax operation grew into a substantial company town, with housing, a hotel, a hospital, and a school for the families of miners working the deposit. Infrastructure built almost entirely around a mineral most Americans outside the mining and steel industries had never heard of. From steel to lubricant, between the wars, researchers began to understand that molybdenum disulfide's usefulness wasn't limited to strengthening steel. It had a second very different property. When ground into a fine powder and applied to metal surfaces, or suspended in oil, it reduced friction far more effectively than liquid lubricants alone. The reason lies in its crystal structure. MoS2 forms in hexagonal, plate-like layers, sheets of molybdenum atoms sandwiched between layers of sulfur atoms. The bonding within each sheet is strong, but the bonding between sheets is weak, which lets the layers slide past each other with very little resistance. Under pressure and heat, the sulfur atoms at the surface of these plates can also form a chemical bond with iron atoms in steel, creating an extremely thin film that adheres to the metal itself rather than simply sitting on top of it as a liquid does. This matters most in what tribologists, scientists who study friction, wear, and lubrication, call the boundary lubrication regime. The brief, high-pressure moments, such as cold starts or heavy loads, when the oil film between 2 moving metal surfaces becomes too thin to fully separate them, and the microscopic peaks on each surface make direct contact. Because MoS2 is a solid rather than a liquid, it is far more resistant to being squeezed out of these high-pressure contact zones than oil alone. By the mid-20th century, this property led the U.S. military and aerospace programs to adopt MoS2 as a dry film lubricant for parts that needed to keep working under extreme pressure, temperature, or vacuum, conditions where conventional oils and greases either broke down or, in the vacuum of space, evaporated outright. Wartime strategic value. Because molybdenum had become essential to both armor steel and advanced lubricants, it remained a strategic target through the Second World War. When Germany occupied Norway in 1940, the Knaben mine, the same valley where farmers had once traded pencil stone for butter, became a site of military significance, and Allied forces carried out bombing raids aimed at disrupting German molybdenum supply from Scandinavian sources during the war. NASA and the moon landings after the war. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the predecessor agency to NASA, which absorbed it in 1958, carried out sustained research into MoS2 as a lubricant for extreme environments, including the vacuum and temperature extremes of space. This research fed directly into NASA's engineering programs. That work paid off in the Apollo program. NASA's own technical documentation on the Apollo lunar module landing gear, confirms that its mechanisms used a molybdenum disulfide dry film lubricant. In the vacuum of space, conventional oils and greases can outgas or break down, so a solid lubricant that chemically adheres to metal, rather than one that relies on liquid film, was the practical choice for hardware that had to deploy reliably on the lunar surface. MOS-2 dry film lubrication has remained a standard choice for satellite and spacecraft mechanisms, bearings, gears, gimbals, ever since, precisely because it performs where liquid lubricants cannot. What the modern research actually shows. MOS-2, as an automotive engine oil additive, has also been studied directly, and the published results are genuinely notable, though they come from controlled laboratory testing, not casual roadside experiments. A 2022 study published in Scientific Reports, part of the Nature portfolio of journals, tested MOS-2 nanoparticles as an additive in SAE 20W50 diesel engine oil. At a concentration of just 0.01% by weight, the nanolubricant showed a 19.24% reduction in the coefficient of friction and a 19.52% reduction in average wear scar diameter compared to the base oil, measured using standardized tribometer testing. The same study also found roughly a 10% improvement in thermal conductivity with the additive present. Other peer-reviewed studies, published around the same time, reinforced the general finding. Research in journals such as Lubricants, Lubrication Science, and Tribology International has repeatedly shown that MOS-2 nanoparticles, when properly dispersed in a base oil, reduce friction and wear compared to the base oil alone, with a degree of improvement depending heavily on particle size, concentration, dispersion stability, and the specific test conditions used. It's worth being precise about what these studies do and don't show. They are laboratory results from standardized rigs, typically 4-ball tribometers, using engineered nanoparticle formulations designed for good dispersion in oil, not necessarily the same as coarser, technical-grade MOS-2 powder, mixed by hand into a road vehicle's crankcase. Real-world engine longevity depends on many variables besides friction coefficient, combustion byproducts, oil chemistry, particle settling and filtration, seal compatibility and driving conditions, and no peer-reviewed study has directly measured whether a home-mixed MOS-2 treatment extends real-world engine life by any specific number of miles. The friction and wear reductions measured in these papers are real. Claims about exact mileage outcomes for a treated daily driver engine go beyond what the published research actually demonstrates. Why the history matters. The arc of this mineral story is genuinely remarkable on its own, without needing exaggeration. A substance. Norwegian farmers once traded pound for butter, became strategically important enough to help determine the outcome of industrial-scale warfare, was studied by the U.S. government's aeronautics research program, and ended up lubricating the landing gear that set the first crewed spacecraft down on the moon. Its tribological properties are well established in the scientific literature. A layered crystal structure that lets sheets glide past each other with very low resistance, and a tendency to chemically bond to metal surfaces, rather than simply flow across them the way liquid oil does. That combination is genuinely unusual, and it explains why MOS-2 remains a serious subject of ongoing tribology research today, more than a century after Norwegian farmers first noticed that a greasy black rock made their cartwheels turn more easily.